this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is a video on how I upgraded my Fractal Torrent and immediately regretted it, and then didn't. And I'll explain what I mean as I go through this video. Now, when I first purchased this case and built in it, I was really happy with it for the most part, because it's a wonderful case with a really nice setup in terms of the airflow. It has two massive 180mm fans on the front and three 140mm fans on the bottom as standard. As you can see from these shots, I purchased the non-RGB version, and then I slapped in a Chromax cooler from Noctua with some black fans, and I put in a single 140mm fan at the back, which I purchased the wrong version of, so I ended up with a white fan and then multiple black ones. So I wasn't completely happy with the look and feel of it. I contacted Fractal and told them about the case and what I'd done, and they were pretty happy with that video, so they kindly sent over some extra fans, but they only sent two. And so I went crazy and purchased a load of extra ones. And then I swapped out all the standard fans, apart from the ones on the cooler obviously, for RGB fans. So these are Fractal's RGB fans. So now I've got two 180mm Fractal RGB fans on the front and four 140mm fans on the bottom and rear of the case. Now this was a pain to set up, but the end result is really nice, and that's the part that I regretted, is the setup process, and I'll talk about why when I go through. Now, RGB fans aren't necessarily a pain for the most part, and these fans are obviously slightly different. You'll notice that one, for example, is ARGB and the other ones are just RGB, so that's worth knowing. I purchased the wrong fans potentially, but Fractal was kind enough to send over the two 180mm fans, and they come with both radiator screws and standard screws as well, so you have the option to mount them in different ways. And the nice thing about these Fractal fans is they're not only huge and offer good airflow, but they're also daisy chainable, so they have two cables on them as standard, one for power and one for RGB lighting. There's no RGB controller in the box or in any of the packs, so you need to chain these cables together and then connect them to an RGB header on your motherboard. I'm going to show you the process for that in a minute, but as you'll see, these RGB fans are pretty nice looking. I'll also show them compared with the standard fans. I'll get them out of the case in a minute, but you can see that they have these RGB cables on them. There's actually two connectors, so you can daisy chain up your fans and then use one of the connections to connect up to the motherboard on your RGB header, assuming you have one. It's using the 5V RGB header, and I'll show you where it's located on my motherboard later on so that you can do the same if you're interested. And the process is theoretically fairly straightforward. It goes from one fan to the next and then connects up to the motherboard. And you can basically just connect up multiple fans and then have control over the RGB lighting, and I'll show you that later as well, from your software. So I'm using Armory Crate from Asus to control the RGB lighting for these fans, and it's fairly straightforward, and it actually looks really nice, as you'll have seen from some of those shots. So I was frustrated with the setup process, and I'll talk about why in a second, but actually the end result looks really good. Now, it is worth noting this is an expensive upgrade for the case. The case is already pretty expensive, and these RGB fans are not cheap. They are, however, massive, 180mm and then obviously 140mm. And I bought two triple packs of the 140mm fans, which was probably excessive because I could have bought one triple pack and then one single fan, but it actually worked out cheaper to buy two triple packs. Don't ask me why, but that's the logic. So now I've got two extra fans I don't need, but who knows, I might use them in a future build. I obviously have options as well. I could have bought another two 180mm fans, because you can actually mount 180mm fans to the bottom of the case. So I could have gone for two large RGB fans on the bottom and two 180mm fans on the front as well, and then a single 140 at the rear, so that would have been another option potentially, and I did consider that briefly. But I thought I'd stick to 140mm because it would fill up the bottom a bit more nicely and would be more of a logical direct swap for the setup. So obviously the process for upgrading is going to be removing the fans that I already have installed, and I went about taking off the rear of the case, and then I remembered all the cable craziness. One of the nice things about this case, if you don't know already, is it has a PWM fan controller at the bottom. So there's a hub down the bottom of here where you can plug in your fans and get the power from them, and then plug that into a header on your motherboard and control the fan speed directly from that. And it makes life a lot easier because you don't have to use system fan headers, so you can plug in all the fans into that and away you go. But it doesn't control RGB lighting, so there's no RGB control in there, just the fan power. But what this means is I had to go through the process of removing all the cables from all the fans that are connected up already to that controller and then taking them out. I found that obviously I'd cable tidied some of them up with plastic ties, and I'd ran some of the cables through channeling and up into the top, and it was a real pain. I've shortened the process here because it would have been painful to watch the entire thing. It took me quite a while to get them out, but basically removed the standard fans. So here you can see the standard 180mm fans are included against the RGB ones on the left. Obviously the RGB ones look a little bit nicer. They technically don't have as much airflow. The specs ever so slightly different. I'll leave that information in the description so you can compare. So I'm doing a trade-off for aesthetics versus cooling. However, I haven't noticed a significant drop in the cooling performance or an increase in temperatures, so I don't think it's really a problem. Obviously, these are still massive fans and they can spin quite quietly and pleasantly, and now they have the benefit of looking a bit nicer. What you will notice though, or I'll show a bit later on, is obviously the main bit of the RGB is sort of facing forward towards the front of the case and pulling air in from the front, and it's not really that visible through the front mesh and through the front panel, and I'll show some of that in a minute. But what you do get is some nice reflections on the inside of the case as well, so stick with me to the end to see some more shots of what that looks like. But I'm actually really pleased with the finish on it. Also, they just look a bit nicer. The contrast of the white and black sits really nicely with the black and white case as it is, and it's a nice little upgrade aesthetically even without the RGB turned on. The process is theoretically pretty straightforward if you're basically swapping like for like as well, because you don't need to worry about any other sort of trays or whatever. But what you do end up with is this crazy mess, and this was part of the frustration, and this is the problem with any RGB fans for the most part from other brands as well, as you end up with loads of extra cables. And one of the dramas with this case is it's a very nice case with fantastic airflow and lots of room at the front, but the rear space is pretty limited, and if you end up throwing loads and loads of cables back there, as you'll see in a minute, it becomes pretty tricky to handle that and to cable tidy things up and just to keep it neat, to the point that it actually becomes pretty difficult to close the rear panel, which was a bit of a frustration. However, for the front fans, it's easy enough to run the cables down to the bottom or up through the top and then out through the back, and kind of end up keeping it quite neat. The end result, actually, you can't really see all those excessive fan cables, at least from the front fans. I found the bottom ones weren't quite so easy to hide, and that top rear one, as I'll show you in a minute, was a complete nightmare. Now, the fan tray at the bottom comes out with just some thumb screws and a little bit of convincing, obviously removing all those cables out. And then I've got the standard fans on there. Those 140mm fans are standard, and they're obviously set to intake again as well. So you've got two large 180mm fans on the front intaking, and then these three large ones on the bottom. I will sing the praises of this case because it is fantastic. It's one of the nicest ones I've built in. It's one of the nicest looking, and obviously offers fantastic airflow thanks to these large fans as well. I've done the review and unboxing videos I'll link to in the description. If you've not seen those already, check them out because it is a great case and a wonderful one to have around. This has my main machine in it that I'm using on a daily basis, and I really enjoy it for a number of reasons. But I wanted to make it look nicer because I've traditionally used RGB cases for quite some time with quite a few different RGB setups. So to go to one without RGB was quite a shock to the system. So now I'm making it glorious, and obviously RGB lighting means better FPS naturally. So, you know, turn it to blue, keeps your system running cold, gives you more FPS. At least that's what I keep telling myself. Now, I have spent a lot of money on this upgrade, so whether you want to do it or not is really going to depend on how much money you have to burn and what you're after in terms of the aesthetics. Obviously, you can buy an RGB version of the case anyway, but I don't believe that you can get the white one with RGB fans. It's worth bearing that in mind. And also, the case becomes more expensive if you go for the RGB option, and even more so if you don't and then you purchase the fans separately. So it is worth considering and doing that early on. But now I've got the fans mounted to the tray, so I basically swapped out the standard fans with the RGB ones, and then I've just got to put them back in. But as you can see, when you've got three fans, you now have a complete mess of cables to deal with and cables to get to the rear, and that was quite a fiddle. And now I'm moving to the rear fan. So as standard, the case doesn't actually come with a rear fan, and I put in this 140mm Fractal fan that I purchased, but I got the wrong one, so it ended up with white fins and it didn't look great. So now I'm replacing it and making sure it matches up with the rest of them. One of the things that I found here is a real pain, is in the top left corner, tucked away, is a hole. That hole is not big enough for all the cables to go through. You can see that I'm running the power cable into that hole, but I actually end up having to run the RGB cable up through where the CPU connections for the motherboard are. So the power connections up there actually has to run off that way. So the actual cable management is a bit of a pain, not something that was cleverly thought out, and a bit of an annoyance. Now here's a look at where the RGB connections are on the motherboard. You can see RGB Gen 2. This is the 5-volt header. You should find this on a lot of the modern motherboards. You'll see that I actually have 2 on this motherboard, plus there's a 12-volt RGB header, but I'm looking for the 5-volt one. It has 3 pins on it, so you can't really plug it in the wrong one. But basically, once all the fans are chained up together, you can then plug this cable in, and then you have RGB lighting control across the entire case. Straightforward, really looks straightforward when you cut out a lot of the work that's gone into it, but then you'll see the back of the case is now a complete mess, and there's a lot of cables back there. Obviously trying to put that panel on becomes problematic. It was quite a tight fit originally. It's even worse now. I've crammed some more cables in there and tried to hide a lot of it away at the rear. So I ended up having to mess around a little bit and try and tidy this up a bit more to make it neater so I could fit that door back on. And that was a bit of a struggle, and this is one of my annoyances with it. So essentially what I've done, and my complaint here, is that I have upgraded my case, but I've also downgraded it. I've upgraded it in terms of RGB lighting and the aesthetics. I've potentially downgraded it in terms of cooling performance, not that I've noticed that, but I have also made a mess of the cables, because now there's a mess at the back, and there's also a little bit of a mess at the front that you might spy if you look a bit closely. And this could be an annoyance depending on your personal preference and also just how precise you are about these things. So you can see at the bottom right here, for example, just behind the intake fans, that there's a mess of cables there. I could probably put in some cable ties to try and tidy them up a bit, but I found I couldn't really run them away very nicely. Now here you can see the front of the case. You'll see that there isn't a lot of RGB light bleed through the front unless you take that front panel off, which is obviously not something you're going to do. But from the other shots you will see there's some nice glow on the rear panels and the surrounding areas. You can also change the RGB lighting, so this is all controlled with an Armory crate. So I'm basically just going through a number of different settings. There's starry night, breathing, rainbow, solid colors, so you can change between colors and do that. You can have reactive ones, you can get system temperatures and things like that. Fairly straightforward to control, and the end result looks nice. It does look a lot nicer than the standard setup that you saw at the beginning, in my opinion, and so it was worth the effort, but it was a fair bit of effort and quite a lot of money. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Let me know in the comments what you think. Hit that subscribe button if you enjoyed. Thanks for watching. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Hope you found this video useful, interesting, hilarious, or otherwise. Take a look at these other videos that I think you might find interesting as well. And have a look at the description for links and other information you might find useful. Click that join button to see the benefits of being a member of my YouTube channel. And most importantly, have a great life.